So I'm gonna first introduce the team I have on with me. I've already recorded with him twice now, I believe, but Josh is on here with me, and I have another very special member here, Ekaterina or Katerina. I believe this is your first time coming on here, so welcome to doing the book clubs with us. So just introduce yourself and your channel, and we'll get started.
Hi, I'm Ekaterina. I'm from channel KatiaPavlovArt. My channel is dedicated to Slavic mythology and culture and arts. So I'm here, first time recording in the book club. I remember reading. It was like in my school curriculum, literature curriculum, to read The Crime and Punishment, and I came back to the book, and I am excited to discuss it with all of you.
Hello, my name is Josh. I run the channel Philosophy for All. I talk about Russian existentialism, a bit about theology as well on the side, and talk quite a lot about social commentary and how philosophy can be applied to the world we live in today. I do have a great affinity for Dostoevsky. My favorite works are The Brothers Karamazov and The Idiot. However, I do enjoy Crime and Punishment, and I think it's phenomenal work, and I'm looking forward to discuss it with you two.
Cool. And I think that's the key question that we can talk about here, which is, of course, we know by the end of the book that Raskolnikov fails. He fails in the sense that he realized that he cannot live up to the ideals that he set up for himself. And the fundamental question of the novel, which is later taken up by Nietzsche, is essentially, did Raskolnikov fail because of individual weakness of a collective condition in mankind, as in every man, by virtue of being a man, is inherently going to inevitably fail to rise above the conventional morality of good and evil? Or was it something else? Was it that he himself was just weak, and that, hypothetically speaking, if another person would come along and bear that weight of operating on a new set of moral principles, would he be able to do it? And I think that's the first question that we have to contend with, right? Because the days that that Dostoevsky was living in, right? It was when uh, ideas of the Enlightenment kind of seeped into the seeped into parts of Russia from the western parts of Europe, and a lot of that had to do with the idea of liberalism and the and this promotion of the individual, right? And that, as a consequence, means promotion of individual values that one may subjectively hold. And of course, Dostoevsky, especially after his days in prison and exile, he became sort of skeptical, right, of this notion. And so I'm gonna start with you, Josh. Do you think, in Dostoevsky's view, Raskolnikov's failure happened because of who Raskolnikov was, or or did it happen because Raskolnikov was like a man like any other? And I think that's the fundamental question that we have to start with.
I think that's definitely a very fascinating question, and I think the most common reading would be to pursue your own morality or pursue this form of. And I don't want to read Dostoevsky through the lens of Nietzsche, because that's always something which is tempting to do. But I suppose, for the sake of simplicity, just perhaps I could call this supramoral state as some state which is beyond good and evil. Can someone go beyond such conceptions of traditional morality, while staying strong, or at least not descending into some sort of insanity? Now, I think the common conception would be to say, well, Dostoevsky believes that's impossible. You see this happen here, and to some degree you see it a bit in The Possessed or Demons, where you see a lot of characters there also trying to carry out their own forms of life and their own forms of meaning and values, which are inconsistent with the traditional landscape which Dostoevsky was proposing. And in there we see almost a stronger kind of formulation of the problem, because of course Raskolnikov, after he commits the murder, seems to descend into some sort of madness. However, on the other hand, people in Demons, they seem to hold themselves up a bit better. Perhaps not. Apologies for my cough, but perhaps they don't hold themselves up in as someone may do. However, nevertheless, they still seem to have some struggle. So it seems to suggest that yes, there seems to be some ability, that individual strength and personal kind of grit or mental fortitude can allow people to at least experiment a bit more with what is good and evil, what's right and wrong. But nevertheless, carrying out such a thought or carrying out such inquiry would naturally lead to some struggles and some problems and weaknesses within one's mental psychological state.
Yeah, I think like the main issue of the Raskolnikov concept, like it's not because there is so many instances when people are literally capable of committing this type of crime and just like live life like it's okay. And I don't personally doubt that it's not possible, because it's possible. But just Raskolnikov himself, he had, I don't know, leftover compassion and leftover, yeah, like those emotions and qualities that they wouldn't let him to cross this line that easily, and he does has this compassion that didn't let him go after the crime was committed. Do I doubt that some people capable of doing that and just walking free after that? Absolutely not doubt.
Well, if you would recall, in the book, Raskolnikov does not say, I am going to murder the pawnbroker because I am going to murder the pawnbroker. He says, I am going to murder the pawnbroker for the benefit of humanity, right? And so part of his morality is to benefit the rest of humanity. And so this kind of comes into question, was he really doing it for himself? And this is important, right? Because then, to some extent, he does, to some degree, care for the impact he has on the society around him. And so there is this duality in him, a conflict in him, so to speak, between the will to power, I'm oversimplifying the term here, and altruism, right? And so, yes, it is true to say that the book here is an exhibition on how it shows a failure of man to live up to his principles. However, it is also clear, or it is also arguable, that these principles weren't sturdy enough in the first place because they lacked that consistency, right? Or at the very least, they lack consistency from a sense of moral conventions, right? So they lack consistency as to how the average Joe would, view good and evil. Where it's like, okay, if you want to extend yourself beyond common norms of good and evil, why do you bother justifying your actions with notions of helping the greater whole of humanity? And I do believe that small detail there kind of is kind of like the string that, if you pull on it, kind of unravels Raskolnikov's set of moral principles altogether. And so that, I think, is important, right? To circle back to the main point, which was that if we're going to talk about Raskolnikov's fundamental moral crisis, we have to go with the fact that not even his moral justifications were consistent with the notion that he was a pure egoist. So that's some food for thought. What, Josh, from anything that I said, is there anything you picked up on that was interesting to you? Hopefully there was.
Yeah, I think there's a few things which are quite fascinating. First of all, I think we could go back to Ekaterina. She said something which is quite interesting about how people can get away with murder and heinous crimes and that's kind of possible. And I think the first thing which comes to mind is like during World War II when people commit war crimes. Of course, there seems to be psychological harm to certain people, but at the same time, some people were able to just sit on the side and say, well, all right then, life goes on, I guess. And so it doesn't seem to be. So and I think that's a very good place to start off with our discussion about whether it's possible, because it does seem that Dostoevsky isn't saying that the struggles are coming from the actions themselves, but perhaps the struggle that is faced by Raskolnikov is not from what he does by killing the pawnbroker. People could do worse and get away with it, almost scot-free, without any repercussions. But perhaps it is the motives upon which Raskolnikov faces that leads to further issues. For example, like you say, there seems to be some conflict between altruism and carrying out a supramoral state of being. There's some conflict between the ability to kind of act morally, and in some forms, altruism itself is a form of morality. So in some sense, in the pursuit of trying to overcome and become this Superman-esque figure, he is in some sense also going against what he wants himself, because he's saying, I'll go over traditional morality and reach this new state of being. At the same time, the reason for doing it is precisely because he is playing within the rules of that state of being. And perhaps you could add a further idea from Dostoevsky and say, well, perhaps the precise reason why we have this problem to do it is because he still does have this sense of divine. There's this sense of redemption and this sense of the good within him, regardless of how much he wants to fight it. And of course, there's people who might not have such a strong sense or attunement to the good, and they might find more struggle, or they might find more ease to get away with these problems. But nevertheless, that sense of the divine may be there, and that sense of the divine might be one of the reasons which leads someone to believe that, okay, actually, what I'm doing is wrong, even no matter how far you try to fight against it. And I think that could be some sense of Freudian or Lacanian kind of twist where you say, well, yes, consciously you can believe in whatever you want, but subconsciously you actually have another realm of existence or another realm of inquiry which you are actually struggling against or struggling with. And that's something which is very interesting. Now, finally, I'd like to add a note upon what you've said, and you're talking about altruism more specifically. And I think one of the things you could say is that Dostoevsky's always seemed to have had quite an interesting relationship with a prophetic vision. And when I mean prophetic vision, I'm not talking about a mystic kind of vision, because, of course, Dostoevsky was deeply in love and was deeply admired the Russian Orthodox Church at the time. And I don't think it would be correct to classify him as an anti-mystic. But at the same time, there is this inbound or innate danger or warning against people who come with these visions. For example, you see Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov, who struggles with this vision of kind of this atheistic realm, and he has the Grand Inquisitor, and there's almost this worry there. And of course, there's Kirillov as well in Demons, or the Possessed, whatever translation you're using, and he also has a vision which arguably you could say is something which is dangerous and something which you should be warned from. And in the same sense, you could say, well, all right. We have this situation of a vision being given to some people. Well, we also have to take that vision with great care and figure out, well, is this vision truly something which is divine and will bring you closer to the divine and closer to benefit humanity, or whether that vision is actually dangerous, regardless of how beautiful it is. And I think that's a warning which can be applied to people throughout time and throughout circumstance. And I think that could be a way in which we could interpret the relationship between Raskolnikov and his vision for humanity, and how his actions tie into that vision. Is there anything else you would like to add upon what I've said, or agree or disagree with?
Yes. There is. Well, first I'm gonna let Ekaterina go if she has anything to say. Right. But so I'm gonna group your statement into two groups. Right. The first is morality in the social sphere. Right. Like how does our morals come from? I you think you kind of touched on that in the war crime comment. And then the other one is like morality in the religious sphere, right? Like, oh, is so it's like, is something more in relation to God? Um, those two, I have thoughts on it, but first, I want to let Ekaterina go so that I can gather my thoughts there.
No problem. Thanks, X. I really like this point, Josh, about subconscious and conscious, because like when you have conscious, you have like one idea, but subconscious, it's whole another story. It can be quite opposite. Yeah, and it's really solid point. Yeah, and also I would like to touch this altruism thing, and like it's like really big part of like Russian mentality about the poor people, and like associating money with like bad things, like if you're rich, that's bad. Yeah, and I think like this concept, like because Raskolnikov, he was really hesitant, but environment and what he like heard in the environment, and that basically led to this action. And yeah, because he heard this talk, how they would discuss how it would be good to just distribute this all lady income to people. Yeah, and he got like more motivation to do it, and more motivation to cross the line. Yeah, it's just like very important, because like there's like a fine line in altruism when you either doing something to feel better about yourself, but it's not really act of compassion, like because like yeah, like sharing is caring, etc. It's just like there is a point between you sharing as you caring about yourself and environment, and sharing to feel yourself, to make yourself feel better. So it's like two types of sharing, and altruism and etc. Yeah, just feel free to carry on.
I think the word you're looking for there, Katrina, is I believe it's called psychological egoism, and I kind of touched upon this years ago talking to friends of mine, and the notion basically states that like every act you do is inherently selfish, no matter how helpful it is to someone else, or how much you intend to help someone else, and without regards to your own self, because in that moment that you're helping someone, your personal agenda is to help that person. So unless you're being coerced or tied behind your back and forced to do something, then it's like it can be argued that it's not selfish. But if you have if you by your own volition help others, uh, you are by extension affirming your own personal agenda, and therefore um, you are acting in an egoist manner, which is important to mention here, because I asked a question earlier. What did I ask? Did I asked if Raskolnikov was a pure egoist, why would he have to justify his um actions on the basis of benefiting mankind? Well, maybe it's because benefiting mankind is a key integral part of um what constitutes Raskolnikov's morality. And in some sense, I would take that into the religious matters, because I do think that in some sense, truth, right, is believed not always because it is true, but rather because we want it to be so for our own survival, right? And falsehoods are believed too for this reason. And so, no matter one's ideology or religion or the prefix that comes before a man's ism, um, feminism, communism, capitalism, whatever. No matter what ideology that he believes to be a part of, or I'm including religion in here too. No matter what he believes in, whenever he needs to take a certain passive action, he will inevitably have to conclude that the path he takes in is congruent with the set of beliefs that he believes in. And I'll take religion as an example because that's on topic here. So in religion, we have to conclude that the path we take is under God, no matter the path, because if we reply in the negative, right? If we say, no, this is not the path of God, then we have no choice but to abandon that course of action. And if we want to keep it, then we have to apply affirmatively, no matter what the action is, because if we want to keep that belief, and if we want to keep the belief and the action, then we have to say that the action and belief are congruent with each other, right? And if they're not, then if we're not, then we either have to drop the belief in the religion, or we have to drop the action. And assuming that you are religious, we're most likely going to drop the action. And so what happens is, no matter what action you take, in the end, you're going to have to say that it is congruent with the religion, because it is the one that is because the religious belief is the unmovable object in this thought experiment, right? And so this is why there is so many contradictions or hyper-specifications in things like what we just does nationalism, or feminism, or capitalism, or why there are so many denominations and sects under a religion. And so I do believe that you talk about how we act rightly has to be anchored to is in many ways, for many people, anchored to what is right under God. Well, I do believe that the right way to act is dependent on what you end up doing, not the other way around. And so what you do is always going to have to be justified as right, lest you denounce your belief. And so in a very real sense, God, therefore, as Nietzsche said, God, therefore, was made in man's image, not the other way around. So that's what I had to say on the whole religious aspect.
I think that's something which is very interesting, and I think both of you raise good points, especially about the danger of religion. I think that Dostoevsky's case here would agree and say that, well, all right, if you do an action, that certain action, regardless of the other influences, you're still ultimately culpable for that action that you do, and that the true danger of a religion, or and I will now just call all these ideologies. I'll just call them religions for the sake of simplicity, because I do think that whether it's a far socialists or capitalists or whatever, the strength of the dogmas within such belief systems are very religious in structure, and as a result, I think for all intents and purposes, we may as well just call them religions. But I think the interesting thing that we have to look at is, well, I think Dostoevsky does disagree with this form of mindless worship, and I think this is the key to the Grand Inquisitor, where he's criticizing the Catholic Church. And it's very interesting of his criticism of the Catholic Church, because on the few bases that he criticizes the Catholic Church, he's criticizing them on the inability for them to allow the people to think. He says the Catholic Church would rather make people happy for just following a set of rules. You'll give them bread and people will believe in them just for the sake of belief. But in reality, even if there is that sense of belief, if there is that sense of happiness, they will not have that individuality. And in the same way, I think that that's a criticism that Dostoevsky has towards the conception of religion at the time. And while he does remain a strict Christian and a religious person, I wouldn't say that he's religious in the same way that these isms are being presented, in the sense that he wants to develop a religion of the individual, which starts off with the individual responsibility for certain actions, upon which other actions can be developed upon. And in some sense, regardless of who you can try to blame other isms or other religions or other belief structures for your actions, you ultimately are the sole person who is morally responsible. And I think the same situation can be applied to Raskolnikov, saying that no matter how good your intentions were, even if it was true, and I'm saying this is quite a big if, I think, but even if it was truly altruistic, I believe every single thing that he was doing was for the good, nevertheless, it still would be evil, because at the end of the day, he still has a responsibility to understand his actions and the consequences of said actions. And of course, this ties on to something that I'm sure we'll discuss a bit later as well. But I think another aspect that you can look at it as well, the reason why he struggles so much is that he enters into a mindset of of belief, of this religious beliefs. And within this mindset is something inherent within this mindset that there is some intrinsic goodness in the world. Regardless of what belief system you have, there is this intrinsic goodness in the world. But the moment you accept that intrinsic goodness, and I think that this is a catch that Dostoevsky creates, that the moment you accept that a certain religion is true, or at least you want to apply a certain religion to your life, you accept some form of intrinsic goodness. But once that intrinsic goodness enters into your life, it cannot be escaped, and it cannot just be merely denied. For once you enter into the rules of, in the same way if you enter into rules of a mathematical axioms, everything from those set of 5 or 6 axioms entails, in the same way that there's, I think, 8 axioms in set theory, you can create infinite amount of sets. In the same way, from that small set of axioms and beliefs you create, the moment you accept that intrinsic goodness, it cannot be contained. And in the same way, you could suggest, well, perhaps Raskolnikov does fall into a similar set of a problem or a similar struggle, where he does take that step and he does accept that intrinsic goodness subconsciously. And as a result, no matter what he does beyond that, no matter how hard he tries to convince himself that these things are not real, it nevertheless cannot be escaped, because that has already engulfed him. It already has engulfed his entire mentality and belief system. And I think that that's something we can think about as well.
I think the idea of redemption, which is the final topic here, right? It is like the ultimate is the ultimate destination that Raskolnikov was sort of Dostoevsky was sort of trying to lead you at through the troubles and tribulations of Raskolnikov, right? And we cannot talk about this without talking about Sonia, right? Whose philosophy, unlike Raskolnikov or Smerdyakov from Brother Raskolnikov, Sonia in a lot of ways is based on the it is in some sense based on the negation of the self. However, I would argue that it is also based on the negation of the sense of self as straying away from the sense of God, right? Which I guess Ekaterina and Josh could comment on later. And so, Raskolnikov originally uses this to taunt her, because in a way she has killed herself for nothing. And so Dostoevsky makes sure to not make self-submission, which is sort of what Sonia did, smooth or glorious, but rather a solemn salvation through suffering, right? And I do believe the idea of redemption ties into this. I'll let Josh speak, and then Ekaterina can add in something, because Josh was the one that brought up the concept of redemption that we're going to discuss right now. So, when you said, Josh, before the recording, when you said, when you want to talk about redemption, what exactly were you going at here? What are the important takeaways that you think is found in the book regarding the idea of redemption?
I think in order to understand redemption, especially the Dostoevskian lens, and the idea of the negation of the self that you raised is something which is very interesting, is that when we're approaching the idea of redemption and such beliefs in Dostoevsky's works, we cannot approach it from the lens of analytic philosophy, the idea that, you have two seemingly inconsistent things, and that necessarily means that it is wrong. But rather, when you're approaching things which are of divine significance, and I'm not using divine in perhaps the traditional sense of the God or something like that, but when it comes to things of such great beauty and such great significance, sometimes it is precisely the most perplexing solution which is at the core, or it is the thing which you have to pin down when you're saying, well, what is redemption? It is this. And when you're looking at this is precisely, it's almost in this Hegelian sense of synthesis, where you're saying, well, all right, you have this negation of the self. In order to fully be redeemed, you have to recognize that what you have done before was horribly wrong, and you have to not necessarily negate it in that sense, but rather you have to recognize that and fully accept it and almost cast it away, cast it into the fire. But at the same time, recognize that there is a way forward. And that way forward is also via, after casting the past into the fire, that you're able to rise above it and develop yourself into something further and flourish from that understanding. And that flourishing could be through struggle itself. As a result, this idea of redemption, I think, in Crime and Punishment is something which is of a similar kind. It's not necessarily something which is very easy to be done. And of course, there's always that question about, well, does Raskolnikov truly return to a good state, or does he truly recover And that's something which I don't think, at least from my memory of the work, I don't think fully the circle of his redemption isn't fully drawn to a close at the end of the work. But nevertheless, he's set on, at least he has a vision of the right track. And in the same way when I'm talking about redemption, it's the idea that no matter what you've done in the past, sometimes it is that full recognition of the past which allows for the development into the future. But also it is precisely that negation of the self which allows the self to be reborn in the greatest way. In the same way a phoenix arises from the ashes, it has to be completely broken down, and from the ashes it is risen again. And that's something which is kind of tied into the theme of redemption.
I think redemption goes case by case. And it's really specifically case by case for what a person have done and what else. And it's just like sometimes when you did something and just it's not enough just to say I'm sorry, and it all becomes super duper fine, easy peasy. It's just I do believe and I agree that redemption is something that you have to build. Like a trust, you build it from doing things and showing with action that you changed, because people change, but at the same time, people don't want to change. For example, Svidrigailov, when he gave money to Sonia, it didn't make him in my subjective eyes, it didn't make him a great person, since he previously physically assaulted women constantly, and employees, peasant women, and that he at the age of basically living this world gave this money that he's not even going to use, and call it end of the day, it doesn't make, in my eyes, him as a redemption case, because I just feel he haven't done anything worthy to be redeemed. For Raskolnikov, it's different story. It's just this redemption thing, you have to build it up, and sometimes you just did a lot of stuff, and it depends case by case.
I do think it is important that you mentioned, Josh, that we never actually see Raskolnikov explicitly win over this, right? Explicitly reach a full closure of redemption, because that kind of implies, right, that that it's not an ongoing process, right? It's not something where you do the crime and then you pay the punishment and then you're done. Right, I think the implication is supposed to be there, that it's like a lifelong process of coming to terms with who you are, and being and constantly keeping tabs upon yourself and your actions, and I do believe that is a very insightful perspective, because it kind of puts the whole overcoming over and done with, because you see this especially in stories and movies, for example, right? Once you take down the problem, it's happily ever after, and it's not like that, right? It's not necessarily happily ever after. But it is a there is in some sense an enriched meaningfulness ever after, which I think you two were hinting at, if I'm not mistaken, Josh.
Yeah, I do think that I think that's one of the interesting things about redemption, and it's at the same time singular. It's at the same time found within one individual moment, and at the same time is stretched out across the future as well. Because there always is, and I think that, I'm not sure whether this is the same for you too, but something which I've noticed is that when I do something and I regret it, there's that moment where you can say, yes, I've repented in some sense, or perhaps I have overcome the problem, I have been reconciled with the situation. But at the same time, that guilt and that struggle, despite me reconciling and moving in the correct direction forward, it's still there, even though I feel refreshed. So I think that there's this almost this need for a synthesis to say, well, both of these two situations are true at the same time. We have to find a way to merge and sync these two ideas together, and that's something which we need to look for, or at least try to reconcile when we are struggling with redemption, because we shouldn't view it as something where, okay, tell the sinner that once he gets his act together, he's going to be solved immediately. But at the same time, you should say, well, actually, once you get your act together, you can work in the right direction. And sometimes getting onto that journey is already part of that reward or that gratefulness. And that's something which is something to think about, I suppose.
Yeah. I'll wrap up soon, but Ekaterina, do you have any thoughts regarding this?
No, I think I don't have on this particular topic. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, right, like that whole idea of, like, that process of repentance is simultaneously it's interesting, right? Because it is simultaneously the cleanser of your moral guilt, but it's also simultaneously that makes you aware just how far you are away from that sort of clarity of conscience, right? Where in some ways, in some ways, you are happier before you even conceive of needing to coming to terms with yourself. And so that's what's interesting, right? Because a lot of the times, people go, well, especially in the case of Raskolnikov, when there's nobody else to um, impose your power upon, or when there's nowhere else to assert your power upon, um, that's when that's when the final that's when you realize that the only person left to assert your power upon is yourself, and then you sort of then you're forced to reconcile uh, that which you have thus far projected and imposed upon others, if I make sense, right? Because when when you're idle and the world is at your fingertips, right, and you have all of these ideas flowing around, and you have the axe to um, you have the axe in your hand to follow through with your principles. In some ways, as nervous as Raskolnikov was, even before committing the murder, in some sense there was that sense of wholeness, because he did not have to reconcile closer with just how nervous he was. And so it was a sense of wholeness brought on by the denial of the inner contradictions that were already brewing. Whether it was a fact that we mentioned earlier about the fact that he even has to justify the murder in the first place, kind of would raise a few questions, right? But he doesn't have to contend with that, because there is no, not just an incentive, but there is no um aching need to take a look at yourself, right? People usually take a look at yourself when they go through some existential crisis, as Raskolnikov did, because there was nobody else to go to, right? That's what an existential crisis essentially is like, forget how society is functioning, right? Forget how other people are operating. Your perception of that is altering, and that's what makes you a go through existential crisis, because it's like, even if the surroundings changed or stay the same, how you view them is turned upside down on its head, and therefore the observer, regardless of the observed, goes through a inner turmoil crisis, which then calls upon to take a look in the mirror, and that's why essentially existential crisis is. And that's when, and mending together that broken reflection, right, of in which the mirror is sort of shattered and you can't really have a good look at yourself. That's when, working on that self sort of becomes like a form of redemption. And I think it is both interesting but um understandable that that process only came when Raskolnikov hit rock bottom, because until then he was able to unleash that angst upon others. And so, yeah, so that's all I would have to say on that. Josh, do you have any closing remarks before I wrap this up?
No, I think you summarized that very well.
All right. Um, Thank you again for coming on. Josh, this is your third time, so thank you again every time. Thank you 3 times now. Ekaterina, thank you for coming on. This is your first time. Um, to the listeners, if any of you have managed to stay on this long, thank you. Um, we'll be back with the next episode. Until then, please like and subscribe, and I will now turn off the recording.